On quiet Maple Street, nestled in suburban Ohio, life seemed to be everything Sarah Mitchell had dreamed of. She had just moved into her new home, a charming two-story house with a cozy front porch and a neatly trimmed lawn. It was the kind of neighborhood people imagined in postcard-perfect dreams: tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes, and neighbors who smiled and waved as they went about their day. Sarah, a 34-year-old graphic designer, was eager to settle in, make this place her sanctuary, and embrace the comforting sense of community. The first few days were pleasant. Each morning, Sarah would step out to water her garden, enjoying the early sunlight on her face as she waved to her neighbors. There was Mr. Peterson from across the street, who was always reading his newspaper on his porch, and the Garcias, who would jog past her house, offering cheerful greetings. Sarah began to think she had finally found her perfect place, a calm, inviting neighborhood where she could put her past behind her. But there was something that kept gnawing at her, a strange feeling, a creeping unease that she couldn't quite name. It started off subtly, a sense that the people around her were watching her more closely than was normal. Whenever she stepped out in the evenings, she would catch glimpses of her neighbors staring, just a second too long before looking away, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. One evening, as she relaxed on her porch with a book, she felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes on her. She looked up and caught sight of Mrs. Eleanor Davis, her next-door neighbor. The elderly widow stood by her window, staring at Sarah with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Sarah forced a smile and gave a small wave, but Mrs. Davis didn't move. She simply watched, her eyes following Sarah's every movement, as if she were studying her. Sarah tried to shrug it off. Maybe Mrs. Davis was just lonely, perhaps a bit nosy. It wasn't uncommon for elderly neighbors to be curious about the newcomers. But the stares persisted, and they weren't confined to Mrs. Davis alone. On her evening walks, she noticed other neighbors glancing at her through barely parted curtains. They were subtle enough that Sarah tried to convince herself she was imagining it. But each time she glanced back, she saw the same lingering looks, the same unsettling focus. Despite her efforts to establish a routine, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She went about her daily life, watering her garden, making small talk with the neighbors, and spending quiet evenings on her porch. But the feeling of being watched was always there, a constant presence that she couldn't escape. One night, as she lay in bed, Sarah heard a noise, a faint creaking sound that seemed to come from downstairs. She tensed, straining her ears. The house was old, and she tried to reassure herself that it was just the floorboards settling. But the sound persisted, a soft creak that moved closer, almost as if someone was walking through her house. Sarah's heart pounded, her breath catching in her throat. She listened until the noise faded into silence, leaving her lying in the dark, her skin prickling with fear. In the morning, she told herself it was nothing, just her nerves, the stress of moving to a new place. But the feeling wouldn't leave her. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the weight of those unseen gazes. It was as if the entire neighborhood was silently observing her, waiting for something. The once idyllic streets now seemed cloaked in shadows, the cheerful smiles of her neighbors masking something darker, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. And always there was Mrs. Davis, her piercing eyes following Sarah's every move, watching from her window, her face expressionless. There was no warmth, no curiosity, just an unsettling intensity that made Sarah's stomach twist. She began avoiding eye contact, taking a different route when she walked to her car, anything to escape those eyes. But the feeling followed her, lingering like a dark cloud, and no matter what she did, Sarah couldn't shake the sense that something was very, very wrong. The unease that had been gnawing at Sarah for weeks seemed to grow with each passing day. It wasn't just the lingering gazes from her neighbors that unsettled her anymore. There were other, more tangible signs that something wasn't right. It started with small things. The garden hose she always coiled neatly by the porch was suddenly unrolled one morning, stretched across the lawn. Another time, the wind chimes that hung from her back porch had been taken down and left on the ground, their strings tangled. Sarah tried to ignore these oddities, convincing herself that it was just her imagination. But the incidents grew harder to dismiss. One night, as she stood in her kitchen, washing dishes, she glanced out the window and froze. Across the fence, in the dim light of her neighbor's yard, she saw Mrs. Eleanor Davis. her frail silhouette standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Sarah through the darkness. Sarah's breath caught, her pulse quickening. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Mrs. Davis watched her, silent, unblinking, as if she were waiting for something. The next day, Sarah tried to talk to Mrs. Davis, hoping to alleviate her fears. She walked over to her neighbor's house and knocked on the door. After a long moment, the door creaked open, and there stood Mrs. Davis, her eyes even more hollow up close. Sarah forced a smile and asked if everything was all right, if perhaps Mrs. Davis needed any help. The old woman just stared at her, her lips slightly parted, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she simply shook her head and closed the door without a word, leaving Sarah standing there, her unease deepening. As the days went by, the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just during the day anymore. At night, Sarah could feel eyes on her even inside her home. She would be lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, and hear soft creaking noises coming from the hallway. Once, she thought she saw a shadow move under her bedroom door, but when she opened it, the hallway was empty. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on her, the air thick with an unseen presence. Then the notes began to appear. They were left in places that only she would notice. In her mailbox, slipped under her front door, even once tucked between the cushions of her couch. Each note was written in shaky, almost frantic handwriting. The messages vague but unmistakably threatening. "You're not alone," one read. Another said, "Watch the shadows." The worst was the one that simply said, "They're coming for you." Sarah's anxiety spiraled. She felt as though she were losing her grip on reality, her mind twisting with paranoia. She tried to reach out to the police, but without any concrete evidence. They dismissed her concerns as mere jitters from moving into a new home. They promised to send a patrol car through the neighborhood, but Sarah never saw any police. She was left alone, with only her fear and the unsettling feeling that her neighbors were somehow part of this, somehow watching and waiting for something she couldn't understand. Mrs. Davis, however, was always there, always watching. Sarah began to notice her at all hours of the day. She would be sitting on her porch, her eyes following Sarah as she moved about her yard. Sometimes Sarah would catch her staring through her window, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes buoyant and unblinking. It was more than curiosity. There was something almost desperate in her gaze, something that made Sarah's skin crawl. One evening, Sarah decided to take a walk to clear her mind. She needed to get out of the house, to escape the feeling of suffocating in her own home. As she walked down Maple Street, she felt the familiar sensation of eyes on her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Mrs. Davis standing in her window, her face partially obscured by the lace curtains, watching Sarah with that same intensity. But she wasn't alone. Across the street, Sarah saw Mr. Peterson standing on his porch, his eyes fixed on her as well. The Garcias, who were usually friendly and cheerful, stood in their driveway, their faces expressionless as they watched her pass by. It felt as though the entire neighborhood had turned against her, their once welcoming smiles replaced by cold, empty stares. Sarah's heart pounded, her hands trembling as she quickened her pace, desperate to get away from their gazes. She could feel their eyes following her, even as she turned the corner, even as she hurried back to her house and locked the door behind her. That night, Sarah's fear reached a breaking point. She heard the noises again, the soft creaking of footsteps moving through her house, the faint rustle of fabric brushing against the walls. She lay in her bed, her eyes wide, her body frozen with fear. She knew someone was there, knew that whoever had been watching her was now inside her home. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost deafening, and Sarah could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Slowly, she reached for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. But before she could press call, she heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from her window. Her heart lurched in her chest as she turned her head, her eyes locking onto the window. There in the darkness was Mrs. Davis, her face pale, her eyes wide with a look that was almost pleading. She tapped on the glass again, her expression filled with urgency, her lips moving soundlessly as if she were trying to warn Sarah of something just beyond her sight. The tapping at the window continued, each sound louder, more insistent, filling Sarah with a mix of terror and confusion. Mrs. Davis stood outside, her face ghostly in the moonlight, her eyes pleading with Sarah as her bony finger rapped against the glass. For a moment, Sarah was too terrified to move. The sight of her elderly neighbor standing there in the dead of night, her lips moving without a sound, was something straight out of a nightmare. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah pushed herself out of bed, her legs trembling as she moved to the window. She opened it just enough to hear Mrs. Davis's frantic whisper. "They're here, Sarah," she said, her voice thin and trembling. "You need to leave. You need to leave now." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She wanted to ask Mrs. Davis what she meant, wanted to demand answers. But before she could, a noise from behind her made her freeze. It was the creak of a floorboard, the unmistakable sound of someone stepping inside her home. Panic surged through her. She turned back to Mrs. Davis, whose eyes were wide with fear. The old woman reached through the window, grabbing Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. "Come with me," she said, her voice urgent. "They took your sister. They'll take you too." The mention of her sister was like a blow to Sarah's chest. Emily, the sister who had disappeared years ago, vanished without a trace when they were both teenagers. Sarah had never known what happened to her, had never gotten any closure. The police had chalked it up to a runaway, but Sarah had always felt there was more to it. And now Mrs. Davis was saying that whatever had taken Emily was coming for her too. Without another thought, Sarah climbed through the window, her bare feet landing on the cold grass outside. Mrs. Davis pulled her along, her grip like iron, and they hurried across the lawn, away from the house. Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see if anyone was following them. Mrs. Davis led her to her own house, pushing her inside and locking the door behind them. The old woman moved quickly, shutting all the curtains and turning off the lights. The house was plunged into darkness, and for a moment Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe, the weight of the fear pressing down on her. Mrs. Davis gestured for Sarah to follow her to the living room, where she pulled a thick, dusty book off a shelf. She opened it, revealing pages filled with old newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. Sarah's eyes scanned the yellowed pages, her stomach churning as she saw photographs of missing people from the neighborhood. Faces she recognized, faces she had seen in the old family photos of her neighbors. And there, among the photographs, was one of Emily, her sister, smiling brightly, her arm around a younger Sarah. The sight of it made Sarah's heart twist painfully. "They've been here for years," Mrs. Davis whispered, her eyes filled with fear and urgency. "They took your sister. They take anyone who gets too close to the truth. I've been watching, trying to protect you, but I can't do it alone." Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear, disbelief, and rage. She wanted to scream, wanted to demand how any of this was possible. But deep down, she knew there was something dark in this neighborhood, something she had sensed from the moment she moved in. The lingering stares, the sense of being watched. It was all connected to whatever had taken Emily. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house. Sarah's breath caught as she turned toward the sound, her heart pounding. Mrs. Davis grabbed her arm, her eyes wide with terror. "They know you're here," she whispered. "They're coming for you." The two women moved quickly, making their way to the back of the house. The walls seemed to close in on them as they hurried through the darkened rooms, the air thick with fear. They could hear footsteps now, heavy, deliberate, coming from the front of the house. Whoever was inside wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. They wanted Sarah to know they were coming. Mrs. Davis led Sarah to a small door at the back of the kitchen. She opened it, revealing a narrow staircase leading down to the basement. "Go," she urged, her voice trembling. "Hide. Don't come out until it's safe." Sarah hesitated, her fear nearly paralyzing her. She didn't want to leave Mrs. Davis, didn't want to face whatever was coming alone. But the look in the old woman's eyes left no room for argument. With a final nod, Sarah descended the stairs, her heart pounding in her ears as she stepped into the cold, dark basement. She crouched behind an old cabinet, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she listened. The footsteps grew louder, closer, the sound reverberating through the walls. She could hear Mrs. Davis upstairs, her voice raised in defiance, and then a crash, something heavy hitting the ground. Silence followed, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow everything. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob as she waited, the darkness around her closing in, her mind filled with images of her sister, of Mrs. Davis, of the faceless watchers who had taken them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Sarah's own ragged breathing. She didn't know how long she stayed there, crouched in the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes felt like hours, and the weight of fear seemed to press down on her, suffocating her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah heard it. The faint sound of a door creaking open, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps moving away. She waited, her body trembling, until the sound faded into the night. Only then did she dare to move, her limbs stiff and aching as she rose from her hiding spot. Slowly, Sarah made her way back up the stairs, her heart pounding as she opened the door to the kitchen. The house was dark and still, the air heavy with a sense of something lost. She stepped into the living room, her eyes scanning the shadows, and that's when she saw her. Mrs. Davis, lying on the floor, her eyes closed, her face pale. Sarah knelt beside her, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse. Relief washed over her when she felt it, faint but steady. Mrs. Davis was alive. She had fought them off, had saved Sarah, just as she had tried to save Emily all those years ago. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she looked down at the old woman who had risked everything for her. She knew now that she couldn't run, couldn't let the guardians, or whoever these people were, win. She had to fight, had to uncover the truth, not just for herself, but for her sister, for Mrs. Davis, and for everyone who had been taken. The dawn came slowly, a faint light filtering through the drawn curtains of Mrs. Davis's home. The night had been long, a twisted and terrifying blur, but Sarah knew she couldn't afford to rest. She knelt beside the unconscious Mrs. Davis, her hands trembling as she tried to shake the old woman awake. The frail figure stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and a weak smile crossed her lips as she saw Sarah. "You made it," Mrs. Davis whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was so afraid." Sarah nodded, her eyes misting with emotion. "You saved me," she replied, her voice thick with gratitude. She helped Mrs. Davis sit up, her eyes darting to the closed curtains. They both knew that whoever had come for Sarah wasn't gone for good. They were biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Sarah couldn't afford to wait. She needed to find answers. "Tell me everything," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear that had still gripped her. "I need to know what happened to Emily, what they're doing, and how we can stop them." Mrs. Davis nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. She motioned for Sarah to help her to a chair, her frail body trembling as she settled down. "It all started years ago," she began, her voice cracking as she spoke. "Long before your sister disappeared. People have been going missing from this neighborhood for decades. No one ever talks about it. Too afraid, I suppose. But I've seen it. I've watched them take people one by one." She took a deep breath, her gaze locking onto Sarah's. "The guardians, they call themselves. They think they're protecting something, some dark secret that the neighborhood holds. They take anyone who threatens their secrets, anyone who starts to question the strange things that happen here." Sarah's stomach churned, the truth sinking in. "Emily," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She must have found out something." Mrs. Davis nodded. She was a bright girl, too curious for her own good. She asked questions, got too close to the truth, and they took her. I tried to stop them, tried to warn her, but they were too fast. Tears filled Sarah's eyes, a mix of rage and grief welling up inside her. Emily hadn't just vanished. She had been taken, silenced because she had dared to dig into whatever darkness lurked beneath the surface of this neighborhood. And now the guardians were after Sarah, determined to erase her just as they had erased her sister. "They've lived here for years," Mrs. Davis continued, her voice trembling. "They blend in, act like everyone else. They watch and they wait. And if anyone gets too close, they make sure they disappear without a trace." The weight of her words settled over Sarah like a suffocating blanket. She had moved here hoping to find peace, to escape the pain of her past, and instead she had walked straight into the heart of the darkness that had swallowed her sister. The realization filled her with both fear and fury. She couldn't let them win. She couldn't let them take her, or anyone else, ever again. Mrs. Davis leaned forward, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "We have to expose them," she said, her voice stronger now. We have to show everyone what they're doing. It's the only way to stop them." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. She knew Mrs. Davis was right, but she also knew the risks. The Guardians weren't just a handful of people. They were part of this community, embedded within it, hidden behind friendly smiles and seemingly ordinary lives. But Sarah couldn't let that stop her. She couldn't let fear paralyze her any longer. With Mrs. Davis's help, Sarah began to gather everything they had, every scrap of evidence, every photograph, every note. They worked in silence, their hands shaking as they spread the contents of Mrs. Davis's journal across the table. There were old photographs of people Sarah recognized, neighbors who had disappeared, their faces now faded and worn. There were names, dates, details of strange occurrences that had never been explained. And there was Emily's photograph, her smile bright and carefree, a reminder of what had been taken from Sarah. As they worked, Sarah began to notice a pattern. Each person who had disappeared had been in the midst of something, a move, a renovation, a change in routine. It was as if the Guardians targeted those who were unsettling the status quo, anyone who brought change or questioned the norms of the neighborhood. It made sense in a twisted way. These people wanted to maintain control, to keep everything exactly as it was, and they were willing to go to any length to achieve that. When they had everything they needed, Sarah turned to Mrs. Davis, her eyes filled with a determination she hadn't felt in years. "We're taking this to the police," she said, "and if they won't help, we'll find someone who will. We can't do this alone." Mrs. Davis nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I've waited years for someone like you, Sarah. I knew you were different from the moment you moved in. You're brave, and you have a reason to fight. I think that's what scares them the most." They packed up the evidence, putting everything into boxes and bags, and made their way out of Mrs. Davis's house. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the quiet street, the neighborhood still and silent. It looked just as it always did, calm, idyllic, perfect. But now Sarah saw it for what it was, a facade, a cover for the darkness that lay beneath. As they reached Sarah's car, Mrs. Davis suddenly paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked down the street. Sarah followed her gaze, her stomach tightening as she saw what Mrs. Davis had noticed. A figure standing in the distance, watching them. It was Mr. Peterson, his eyes locked on them, his face blank, expressionless. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge them, just stood there watching. Sarah's heart pounded, her hands shaking as she opened the car door. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Davis nodded, her eyes never leaving Mr. Peterson as she climbed into the passenger seat. Sarah started the car, her eyes flicking back to the figure still standing at the end of the street. He didn't move, didn't flinch, even as they pulled away. As they drove out of the neighborhood, Sarah felt a mix of fear and hope. They had the evidence, they had each other, and they had a plan. The Guardians might have taken her sister, but they weren't going to take her, and they weren't going to silence Mrs. Davis. The fight was just beginning, and for the first time, Sarah felt like she had a chance, however small, to bring the truth into the light and stop the darkness that had plagued Maple Street for so long. The drive to the police station was filled with a tense, uneasy silence. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see one of the Guardians following them. Beside her, Mrs. Davis sat stiffly, her face pale but determined. They both knew this was their only chance. If they didn't act now, the Guardians would come for them again, and next time they might not escape. When they arrived at the station, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. The building was solid and reassuring, a reminder of the authority that could protect them. They gathered the evidence, boxes filled with photographs, notes, and journals, and made their way inside. The officer at the front desk looked up, his expression one of surprise as they approached, weighed down with their collection of grim evidence. Sarah wasted no time, her voice trembling but firm as she spoke. "We need to speak to someone about a series of disappearances in our neighborhood. We have evidence, photos, notes. People are in danger." The officer blinked, his eyes narrowing as he took in the seriousness of her tone. He nodded, gesturing for them to follow him to an interview room. "Wait here," he said. "I'll get someone who can help." As they waited, the minutes felt like hours. The room was small and cold, the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Sarah's heart pounded, her mind racing with thoughts of Emily, of everything that had happened since she moved to Maple Street. She thought of the kind smiles of her neighbors, the friendly waves, all of it now tainted with the knowledge of the darkness that lay beneath. Finally, a detective entered the room. He was a tall man with a stern face, his eyes sharp as he looked at Sarah and Mrs. Davis. "I'm Detective Harris," he said, sitting down across from them. "I understand you have information about some disappearances?" Sarah nodded, her hands shaking as she pushed the first box toward him. "My sister disappeared years ago," she said, her voice cracking. "And now they're coming for me. There's a group in my neighborhood. They call themselves the Guardians. They've been taking people for years, and no one's ever done anything about it." Detective Harris's expression remained unreadable as he opened the box, his eyes scanning the photographs and notes inside. He picked up one of the photographs, his brow furrowing as he examined it. "These are all from your neighborhood?" he asked. Mrs. Davis leaned forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I've lived there for decades," she said. "I've seen them take people, families, children. They hide in plain sight, and they've been doing it for years. They took Sarah's sister, and they'll take her too if we don't stop them." The detective's eyes flicked between Sarah and Mrs. Davis, a skeptical glint in his gaze. He sighed, setting the photograph down. "These are serious allegations," he said. "Do you have any concrete evidence that links these disappearances to specific individuals?" Sarah's heart sank. She knew how it sounded, like the paranoid delusions of a desperate woman, but she couldn't let that stop her. She leaned forward, her voice filled with urgency. "Please," she said, "just come to the neighborhood. Talk to the people there. You'll see there's something wrong. They're hiding something." Detective Harris hesitated, his eyes meeting Sarah's. For a moment, she thought he was going to dismiss them, to tell them to leave. But then he nodded, a reluctant sigh escaping him. "All right," he said, "I'll send a couple of officers to check it out. But I need you both to stay somewhere safe until we figure this out. If what you're saying is true, you could be in serious danger." Sarah nodded, relief washing over her. It was a small step, but it was something. She and Mrs. Davis were escorted out of the station, given instructions to stay at a motel nearby while the police investigated. As they left, Sarah couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had done it. Maybe they had finally brought the truth to light. But as night fell, that hope began to waver. The motel room was dark and cold, the thin curtains barely blocking out the glow of the streetlights outside. Mrs. Davis sat by the window, her eyes darting nervously to the parking lot, while Sarah paced the room, her mind racing. What if the police didn't find anything? What if the Guardians had already covered their tracks? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat, her eyes meeting Mrs. Davis's. They both knew better than to answer it. Sarah crept to the door, peeking through the peephole. Her blood ran cold. Outside, she saw two figures standing in the dim light, their faces obscured by the shadows. She knew without a doubt that they were here for them. Panic surged through her. She turned to Mrs. Davis, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to go. Now." Mrs. Davis nodded, her face pale as she grabbed the bag they had packed earlier. They moved quickly, slipping out the back door of the motel room, their footsteps silent on the pavement. The night air was cold, biting at Sarah's skin as they crept along the side of the building, staying in the shadows. They reached the parking lot, and Sarah's heart pounded as she spotted her car. They were almost there when a voice cut through the silence. "Where do you think you're going, Sarah?" She turned, her breath catching in her throat. It was Mr. Peterson, his face twisted into a cold smile, his eyes filled with something dark and menacing. He stepped toward them, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. Sarah's pulse raced, her fear nearly paralyzing her. But beside her, Mrs. Davis stepped forward, her voice strong and steady. "You won't take her," she said, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Not this time." Mr. Peterson's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. And then from the distance, the wail of a police siren cut through the night, growing louder, closer. The sound seemed to break whatever hold the Guardians had over them, and Mr. Peterson's expression shifted, anger, then fear. He turned, disappearing into the darkness just as the police car pulled into the lot. Sarah's knees gave out, and she sank to the ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The officers rushed over, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, and for the first time, Sarah felt a sense of safety. They were going to be okay. They had made it. Mrs. Davis knelt beside her, her hand resting gently on Sarah's shoulder. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with both exhaustion and hope. "We brought them into the light." The next few days were a blur of questions, investigations, and revelations. Sarah and Mrs. Davis were taken to a safe place while the police began their work. For the first time, it felt like the neighborhood's secrets were finally being brought to the light, and the Guardian's web of influence was starting to unravel. Detective Harris returned to the neighborhood with a full investigative team. They knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, and pieced together the pattern of disappearances that had haunted the community for decades. The evidence Sarah and Mrs. Davis had provided was just the beginning. As the investigation deepened, more neighbors began to talk, some out of fear, others out of a long-buried guilt that had finally come to the surface. It turned out that many in the neighborhood knew more than they had let on. They knew about the disappearances, knew about the Guardians, and some had even been complicit, turning a blind eye, following instructions out of fear of becoming the next victim. But now, with the police combing through every detail, the veil of secrecy that had protected the Guardians was finally being torn away. Mr. Peterson, one of the key members of the Guardians, was arrested. He had lived on Maple Street for over 40 years, his friendly demeanor hiding a much darker purpose. He and a handful of others had formed the Guardians as a twisted means of protecting the neighborhood from any perceived threat. Anyone who challenged the status quo, anyone who didn't conform to their vision of what the community should be. The disappearances had all been orchestrated under this guise, each victim carefully chosen, each disappearance covered up with chilling precision. For Sarah, the revelations were both a relief and a deep source of pain. Knowing what had happened to Emily, that her sister had been taken by these people, by someone she had once trusted, brought a grief that was almost unbearable. But it also brought her closure. Emily hadn't just vanished. She hadn't run away. She had been taken. And now, finally, those responsible would face justice. Mrs. Davis was hailed as a hero. She had risked everything to protect Sarah and to expose the Guardians. And the neighborhood, those who had lived in fear, too afraid to speak up, finally recognized her for her courage. Sarah stayed by her side through it all, helping her as she recovered from the ordeal. The bond that had formed between them was unbreakable, forged in the fire of their shared struggle. The neighborhood itself was changed. The perfect facade of Maple Street had been shattered, and with it, the illusion of safety that had once made it so idyllic. People were wary, unsure of who they could trust, unsure of what secrets their neighbors still kept. But there was also a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, now that the truth was out, they could begin to heal. The stares that had once filled Sarah with dread were now different. There was no longer that lingering suspicion, that sense of something hidden. Instead, there was recognition, understanding, and for the first time, a sense of solidarity. Sarah decided to stay. She had thought about leaving, about packing up and moving far away from Maple Street and the memories it held. But this was her home now. It was where she had faced her greatest fear, where she had fought for her sister and for herself. It was where she had found strength she didn't know she had, and where she had found an unlikely ally in Mrs. Davis. The day after Mr. Peterson was taken away, Sarah stood on her front porch, the morning sun warming her face. The street was quiet, the air crisp and fresh, and for the first time since she had moved in, she felt at peace. She looked over at Mrs. Davis's house and saw the old woman standing by her window, watching her. But this time there was no fear in her eyes, only a gentle smile, a nod of understanding. Sarah nodded back, a small smile tugging at her lips. The haunting gazes that had once filled her with terror were gone, replaced by something much deeper, a sense of connection, of having faced the darkness together and come out on the other side. But even with the arrests, the investigations, and the sense of justice, there were moments when the unease would creep back in. The memory of those silent, lingering stares would return, a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. The scars left by the Guardians would take time to heal, and the shadows they cast would always linger, just at the edges of her mind. Still, Sarah knew she wasn't alone. She had Mrs. Davis, and she had the strength she had discovered within herself. The secrets of Maple Street had been exposed, and while the neighborhood might never be the same, it was finally free from the darkness that had held it captive for so long. Sarah turned and walked back into her house, the door clicking shut behind her. The sun continued to rise, casting its light across Maple Street, and with it came the promise of a new beginning. The neighborhood was far from perfect, but it was real, and it was hers. And as Sarah stood in her living room, she took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the morning fill her, ready to face whatever came next.